In this video, we're going to look at the rise of the machines, part 2. And we're going to especially look into the industrial system. And the overarching question we're going to look into is, how did the Industrial Revolution change the way people worked, traveled, communicated, and lived, and so on. Now, the Industrial Revolution is somewhat of a misnomer because industries did exist for a long time, but it was mostly through what we call the domestic system, in which you had people working from home. Now, often you would have somebody who would have to go through at least 7 years as a journeyman or an apprentice and learn how to produce something from the beginning to the end. This is skilled labor. And basically you were paid for the number of items you completed, and to the degree to which you made it a quality item. So in this scene here, you can take a look at a woman who is spinning thread. You see her daughter in the background, and there's old Granny over here on the side. Extended households were very common. And up in the loft is where you would have found raw materials, such as wool or linen or whatever. Now contrast that with the industrial system, which is also known as the factory or wage system. And what you see in the background here is a carding mill, in which you see mostly women working on producing wool. Now, instead of skilled labor, you have unskilled labor, which is obviously much cheaper, and one of the main reasons why mass production is less expensive. The wages were based on how many hours you worked, not how many items you produced. And almost always, men received more pay than women, and certainly more than children. Long hours were customary. It wouldn't be unusual that somebody could work up to 12, even 14 hours in a day. What many people said, from dark till dark. And in the early years of industrialization, no unions or strikes were allowed or legalized by the governments. And since many families relied on their children to earn money, child labor was rampant, even with kids younger than 5 years old. Starting from the Midlands in the United Kingdom, around here, you can see that it diffused to places like the United States, but also to areas like Belgium, and also into Germany, like the Ruhr Valley and Saxony, also into France and Italy, even into Poland and Austria, like around Silesia, and further along to Russia and even Japan. So how did this happen so rapidly? Certainly one of the answers has to do with geography. Because of James Watt's steam engine, the factories no longer had to be located near fast-flowing rivers to get the water wheels to work. They could now be located virtually anywhere, and certainly in cities where there was great access to cheap labor. Now, the steam engine was also adapted to other things. For instance, Robert Fulton was the first one to invent the steamboat. This is a drawing of the Clermont, which was the first steamboat built in 1807. Notice the water wheel here? Instead of the water driving a water wheel, causing the gears to turn, the reverse happens with the steam engine, having the gears cause the water wheel to turn and therefore move the boat. Previously, shipments and people would be able to move downstream on a river, but moving upstream required a series of ropes attached to horses or donkeys that would pull the boat back upstream. Of course, the steamboat changed all that. And even more impactful was the invention by George Stephenson. In 1814, he invented the locomotive. And what you see here is an artist's rendition of what he called the rocket. In 1829, this locomotive went a whopping 30 miles an hour. Now, by today's standards, that seems pretty slow. And in fact, some horses can go faster than 50 miles an hour. Of course, only for a few minutes, and then they are exhausted. It was the locomotive, also known as the iron horse, that was so revolutionary because it was a sustained speed of at least 30 miles an hour. And the further away you were, the more efficient it really was. To understand this graph, look if you were to travel from London to Manchester. If you go back to 1750 by horse and buggy, it would have taken you approximately 3 days to get there. Fast forward to shortly after the locomotive becomes available, and you reduce that time to perhaps 5 or 6 hours. The difference in the speed of travel will be something like traveling between Fort Lauderdale and Orlando in 15 to 20 minutes. That's the impact the locomotive had back in its day. And to look at the travel in the United States, going from New York to, let's say, on the other side of Illinois would have taken you about 6 weeks back in 1800. Fast forward around 50 years, and from New York to the same distance would only be slightly over 2 days. Its impact was truly revolutionary. The development of railroads across industrialized nations around the world brought a wave of change to these countries. It had been customary in towns across the United States and other countries that the times could be different depending on which place you were at. Now, this was fine if you were traveling by horse and buggy, but trains connected the world like never before. And how would you prevent collisions on the tracks, especially if conductors are using times from different places? Now, this changed in the United States in 1918 with the establishment of standard time zones. Since then, there have been numerous changes to the time zones, but the basic concept remains the same. Starting from the prime meridian around Greenwich, England, the global time zones were standardized. Now, improving communication dramatically came the invention by Samuel Morse. Now, of course, he did invent Morse code, but more specifically, he invented the telegraph in 1844. The first confirmed message was sent across 30 miles of wire between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, sending, "What hath God wrought?" which means, "What has God brought?" A fairly bold statement for an invention. And by 1866, a series of telegraph wires were strung across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting the Americas to Europe. So messages could be sent almost instantaneously, as opposed to taking weeks. A new process of forging steel was developed partially by Henry Bessemer, which produced a much stronger steel, which of course would be better for making more reliable steam engines and even constructing taller buildings. The converter is tilted down and low-grade molten iron is poured into the mouth. Then the apparatus is swung back to vertical and a blast of air is blown through the base of the converter. Since the low-grade iron is full of impurities, such as carbon, the air burns off the impurities, leaving behind a more pure form of iron, which is the foundation for a strong steel. Nonetheless, tall buildings were still not practical until the invention of Elisha Otis. Now, you've probably seen his name on many of these devices, and what he invented was the passenger elevator back in the 1850s. This drawing depicts an event in which he had a strongman cut a rope holding the elevator up. The safety mechanism he designed immediately went into action and prevented him from falling. Now buildings could be constructed taller and people could reach those heights more safely and comfortably. If you're ever in downtown Manhattan, you can visit the first elevator that was ever put into a building. Interestingly enough, the original elevator is still in place and is still in working condition. This began a building craze that has not stopped to this very day. Now, by some accounts, in 1864, in Liverpool, United Kingdom, the very first skyscraper was built. However, it was probably just the first metal-framed glass curtain-walled building. Now, a glass curtain wall essentially means that it was not a weight-bearing wall, and many have discounted it as being the first skyscraper, being only 5 floors. By most accounts, in 1884, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, Illinois has that title, standing at 138 feet or 10 floors. And in the years later, different cities and different countries saw the rising heights of ever-increasing buildings as technology and innovation reached to new heights as well. And the record holder today is the Burj Khalifa building in Dubai of the United Arab Emirates, standing at a whopping 2,717 feet. Because of human innovation, quite literally, the sky's the limit.